There was a night, many years ago, when I sat alone in my study, surrounded by the silence that only comes after a long battle with one's own mind. The fire had burned low. The papers on my desk were filled with the names of men I had spent decades observing: Carnegie, Edison, Ford, Rockefeller, Lincoln, Emerson, and I remember asking myself a question that had haunted me for nearly 30 years. How was it that these men, separated by geography, by century, by temperament, by fortune, had all spoken of the same secret faculty, not imagination, not intuition as the world commonly understood it, something stranger, something that operated, as Edison once told me, as if a higher mind had taken temporary residence in mine? That night, I understood that I had been studying the wrong organ of the mind. The treasure was not in the conscious will, nor even in the subconscious. It lay one chamber deeper, and the door to that chamber, I came to learn, opens only for those who have served a single definite purpose long enough to deserve its company. I have called this faculty by many names in my writings. The sixth sense was the term I used most often, because it stood at the apex of the 13 principles of achievement and seemed at first to be the highest faculty available to a man. But the longer I lived with the men who possessed it, the more I came to suspect that what I had named the sixth sense was, in truth, only the threshold of something further, a still deeper faculty, a faculty that did not merely whisper hunches and warnings, but that opened, however briefly, into the great reservoir of infinite intelligence itself. I came in my private notes to call this the seventh sense, the hidden faculty, and I shared it openly with very few, not because it was secret in the manner of mysticism, but because it could not be understood by a mind that had not first earned its passage. What the lives of great achievers have been trying to tell us for centuries is this: there exists, beyond the 5 physical senses and beyond the intuitive sixth, a seventh capacity in the human being. It is not given at birth, it is not earned by study, it is not bought, inherited, or borrowed, it is forged. And it is forged by one thing only: the long, faithful, often lonely service of a definite major purpose, held in the heart with such devotion that the subconscious mind finally surrenders its boundaries and becomes a living conduit between the man and the universal intelligence that animates all things. Most men never live long enough in the presence of a single purpose to even suspect that this faculty exists. They drift from one ambition to another, never holding any of them long enough for the deep root system to form. They mistake restlessness for ambition and novelty for growth, and so they live and die having never once felt the touch of the seventh sense, never once heard the inner voice that does not belong to the chattering ego, but to something vast, calm, and astonishingly accurate. Edison once told me that the most important inventions of his career did not come from his thinking. They came, he said, through me, not from me. And he said it without the slightest trace of mysticism. He said it the way a carpenter speaks of his tools. Here begins the darkest game of the subconscious mind. For the seventh sense cannot be commanded. It cannot be summoned by force of will, nor seduced by intellectual sophistication. It does not respond to the man who demands. It responds almost without exception to the man who has served. And this is where most modern seekers fail, for they approach the higher faculties of mind in the spirit of a customer rather than a servant. They want results. They want techniques. They want a method that will deliver to them by next Tuesday, the kind of insight that took Emerson 40 years of disciplined inner life to receive. The universe, I came to see, does not negotiate on these terms. It bestows its highest gifts only upon those who have proved, through years of unbroken devotion, that they will not misuse them. I want to tell you about a practice I developed in my own life, which I called the Council of Invisible Counselors. I have written about it before, but I do not believe I have ever fully explained why it worked or what it actually was. For many years, I had observed that the great achievers I studied did not merely admire the figures who had come before them. They communed with them. Carnegie spoke of Spencer as though Spencer were still living in the next room. Lincoln carried Shakespeare and the Bible into his loneliest hours and spoke with their authors as one speaks with a trusted friend. Emerson held imaginary discourses with Plato. There was a pattern here, and the pattern was older than any of these men. It went back to Marcus Aurelius, who began his meditations by naming the men whose souls he had taken into his own. It went back further still, to the philosophical schools of antiquity, where the disciple was taught to live in the company of the great even when they were dead, I decided to attempt the practice myself. Each night, in the quiet hour before sleep, I would close my eyes and call into my imagination a council of 9 men whose qualities I most wished to absorb: Lincoln for patience and humanity, Emerson for spiritual insight, Edison for inventive persistence, Carnegie for organization and judgment, Ford for practical decisiveness. There were others. I would seat them in my mind around a long table, and I would address each one in turn, asking him to lend me his particular strength, to instruct me in his particular wisdom. At first, this was nothing more than disciplined imagination. I knew this. I made no claim to anything higher. But after some months, and I tell you this plainly, the figures at that table began to behave in ways I had not designed. They spoke. They corrected me. They contradicted one another. Lincoln would say things I had not put into his mouth. Emerson would smile at me with a knowing I had not authored. Now, I am not a mystical man by temperament. I am a researcher. I deal with what can be observed and what can be tested across thousands of cases. So I asked myself, what is happening here? Have I gone mad? Or have I stumbled by accident upon a doorway that the great men of every century have known about? And the answer, I came to believe, was the second. What I had done by holding these 9 figures in my imagination night after night with absolute consistency was to construct a kind of inner instrument, a tuned receiver, through which the higher faculty could express itself. The figures were not real in the ordinary sense, but the wisdom that came through them was not mine. It was the wisdom of the 7th sense, using the only language my conscious mind could accept, the voices of men I respected. But the most surprising part comes only now. Years later, I began to notice that the council was no longer needed. The 9 men who had once been so vivid in my imagination gradually faded. In their place came a single, quiet, unmistakable voice, neither mine nor theirs, but somehow older than both. A voice that did not argue, did not flatter, did not demand. A voice that simply knew. And I understood then that the Council of Invisible Counselors had been, all along, a scaffolding, a device by which the conscious mind, suspicious of its own depths, could be tricked into trusting the higher faculty long enough for that faculty to establish residence. Once the residence was established, the scaffolding fell away. What remained was the 7th sense itself. I want you to understand something carefully here, because it is the point at which most teachers go astray. The 7th sense is not imagination. Imagination is the workshop of the mind, and it is a magnificent workshop. Without it, no definite purpose can ever be formed, no plan ever organized, no future ever envisioned. But imagination, however creative, still operates within the boundaries of what the individual mind contains. The 7th sense operates beyond those boundaries. It draws upon a reservoir of intelligence that is not limited by the experience or knowledge of the individual. This is why Edison, who had no formal education in the deeper sciences, could intuit principles that the academic physicists of his day had not yet articulated. This is why Lincoln, who had read few books but had read them deeply, could speak of human nature with an accuracy that statesmen of vastly greater learning could not match. They had access to something the others did not. What Hill said about this subject was deeply unsettling, and I will not soften it for you now. I came to believe, and I held this belief privately for many years before I dared write it, that there is no such thing as an original idea generated by the individual mind alone. Every great insight, every transformative invention, every philosophical breakthrough enters the human world through a man, but it does not originate in him. It originates in the universal intelligence, and it selects as its vessel the man who has prepared himself to receive it. This is why so many discoveries occur simultaneously in different parts of the world. The idea was ready, it was looking for a receiver, and it descended through the first mind that was tuned to its frequency. Consider the implications of this for a moment. If it is true that the great ideas are not invented but received, then the question of personal achievement is no longer a question of intelligence, talent, or even effort in the ordinary sense. It becomes a question of reception. Have you made yourself a fit instrument? Have you held your purpose with such fidelity that the higher intelligence trusts you with its insights? Have you cleared the inner channels of fear, doubt, envy, and indecision so that when the message arrives, it can pass through cleanly? The men I studied had done this work, not all of them consciously. Some, like Ford, would have been embarrassed to speak of it in such terms. But the work had been done all the same, through years of unwavering devotion to a single aim. The detail most people overlook is hidden right here. The seventh sense does not arrive in dramatic moments of revelation. It arrives in the smallest impressions, the quietest hunches, the faintest suggestions that pass through the mind so subtly that the untrained man dismisses them entirely. A sudden reluctance to take a particular train, a peculiar feeling that a certain man should be approached with a certain proposal, a name that surfaces in the mind without apparent reason. The amateur calls these things coincidence and forgets them. The man who has cultivated the seventh sense recognizes them as messages and follows them. And in the following, his life begins to organize itself around a guidance that is wiser than his own conscious calculations. I observed this pattern in nearly every great achiever I studied. Carnegie made his most important business decisions on the basis of what he called feelings I could not justify by argument. Edison spoke of laboratory breakthroughs that came to him in moments of half sleep. Ford described entire engineering solutions that arrived in his mind already complete, requiring only that he write them down. Lincoln navigated the political crises of the Civil War by an inner compass that often defied the counsel of his most experienced advisors, and he was right repeatedly where they were wrong. None of these men would have called himself a mystic. All of them were operating, whether they named it or not, by the seventh sense. The real turning point begins here, for if the seventh sense is real, and I have staked my life's work on the conviction that it is, then the question every modern man must ask is not whether he possesses it, but whether he has done the work required to awaken it. And the work, I must tell you plainly, is not what most expect. It is not meditation in the popular sense, though stillness is part of it. It is not affirmation, though autosuggestion plays a role. It is not visualization, though the counsel of invisible counselors is a powerful aid. The work is something deeper, and it is something the modern world is structurally hostile to. It is the work of holding a single definite purpose in the heart, without distraction, without compromise, without the seduction of alternatives, for as long as it takes for the universe to respond. Modern man has lost the compass of his inner purpose, but not the need for it. He lives in a world that fragments his attention into 10,000 pieces every day. He carries in his pocket a device designed to interrupt every silence that might otherwise have deepened into insight. He is offered every hour a new opinion, a new outrage, a new entertainment, a new craving. And in this perpetual scattering, the long, deep root of definite purpose cannot form. The soil of his inner life is turned over so frequently that nothing of consequence can grow there. And so when he wonders why the great faculties of which the ancients spoke seem closed to him, he need not look for the answer in heaven. The answer is in his own habits. I want to speak to you now about the relationship between the seventh sense and what I have always called infinite intelligence. Some have accused me of vagueness on this point, and I will admit the accusation has merit, because the thing itself does not yield to precise language. But I will say this much. Infinite intelligence is the intelligence that organizes the atom, that turns the seasons, that draws the seedling toward the sun, that brings two strangers to the same crossroads at the same hour. It is not a personality in the conventional religious sense, though it has been called by many religious names. It is not a force in the mechanical sense, though it operates with perfect lawfulness. It is the living mind of the universe, and it is accessible, partially, imperfectly, but truly, to the human being who has prepared himself to receive its impressions. The seventh sense is the organ of that reception. What the lives of great achievers have been trying to tell us for centuries is that the universe is not indifferent. It is not hostile. It is not even neutral. It is, in some way that defies our ordinary categories, responsive. It responds to clarity. It responds to persistence. It responds to faith held without flinching through the long night of apparent failure. And when it responds, it does so through the seventh sense, through that quiet inner faculty that suddenly knows what it could not have known by any ordinary means, that suddenly sees the path where there was no path, that suddenly produces the right word, the right name, the right move at precisely the moment it is needed. I have watched men receive these gifts and squander them. The seventh sense, once awakened, does not remain awakened automatically. It can be lost. It is lost when a man, having received great insights, begins to credit them entirely to his own cleverness. It is lost when success makes him deaf to the quiet voice that brought him there. It is lost when wealth surrounds him with flatterers who tell him he is a genius, until he begins to believe them and stops listening for the deeper guidance. The graveyard of great careers is filled with men who once had the faculty and lost it through the slow corruption of self-importance. The faculty serves the humble servant of purpose. It withdraws from the proud master who thinks he no longer needs it. Here is the paradox that lies at the center of this teaching, and it is one I have never seen fully resolved. The seventh sense gives the greatest power available to a human being, the power to receive direct impressions from the universal intelligence itself. And yet it gives this power only to the man who has stopped seeking power for its own sake. It gives clarity only to the man who has surrendered his demand for certainty. It gives guidance only to the man who has admitted at the deepest level that his conscious mind is not sufficient to direct his own life. The faculty arrives at the moment the ego steps aside, and the ego, I have observed, does not step aside willingly. It is broken into stepping aside by the long discipline of purpose, by the repeated experience of being wrong, by the slow education of failure into faith. In the darkest corner of your failures waits the light you most fear to face. I have written this sentence in many forms over the years, but I do not believe I have ever meant it more directly than now. The seventh sense does not awaken in the man whose life has been smooth. It awakens in the man whose definite purpose has been tested by such repeated defeat that he has been forced, finally, to look beyond his own resources. The defeats are the curriculum. The failures are the initiations. Lincoln's 7 major political losses before his presidency were not obstacles on the path to his greatness. They were the path. Each defeat hollowed out a little more of his self-reliance and made room in the cleared chamber for something larger to enter. By the time he reached the White House, he was no longer governing by his own calculations. He was governing by the seventh sense, and history bears witness that he governed better than any man of his era could have governed by ordinary means. This is the discovery I want you to carry with you. The faculty exists. It is real. It is available. But it is available only on terms that the modern temperament finds almost intolerable. It requires that you choose one definite major purpose and stay with it long past the point where staying feels productive. It requires that you accept failure as instruction rather than evidence. It requires that you cultivate the inner stillness in which the quiet voice can be heard against the deafening noise of an age that has industrialized distraction. It requires that you do this work largely alone, because most of those around you will be busy chasing the surfaces and will not understand why you have descended. But I will tell you what you receive in exchange. You receive a guide. You receive a guide that does not flatter you, that does not deceive you, that does not lead you astray for its own purposes, because it has no purposes of its own apart from the unfolding of the highest possibility within you. You receive a counselor more wise than any human counselor you could hire, more patient than any teacher you could find, more accurate than any system of analysis you could devise. You receive in the end the experience of being accompanied through your life by an intelligence greater than your own, and of knowing in moments of crisis that you are not deciding alone. I have watched this transform men beyond all recognition. I have seen men who began as drifters become, within a decade of disciplined inner work, the kind of presence that others naturally turn toward in difficulty. I have seen men whose early lives gave no hint of greatness become, through the long cultivation of the seventh sense, instruments through which whole industries were reshaped. The transformation is not in the personality remains. The transformation is in the channel. The man becomes a channel through which something larger than himself is permitted to flow. And once he becomes such a channel, the question of his personal success becomes almost beside the point. The work itself, the contribution itself, the lives he touches, these become the measure, and the measure is more than enough. I want to leave you with one further observation because it has weighed on me through the writing of this. The seventh sense is not a private possession. It is a shared inheritance of the human being, and every man who awakens it does so not only for himself, but for those around him. The man in whom this faculty has come alive begins, almost without intending it, to awaken something in others. His presence becomes catalytic. The young men who come to him for advice receive more than advice. They receive a transmission. They feel in the quiet authority of his voice the possibility of a depth they had not known they contained. This is how the faculty has been passed forward through history, not in books, though books help, not in lectures, though lectures help, but in the quiet contact between one man who is awakened and another who is ready to begin. When was the last time you sat in silence long enough to hear the voice of your definite purpose speaking back to you? When was the last time you held still long enough for the deeper guidance to find its way through the noise? Most of us cannot answer that question without discomfort, because the honest answer is that it has been a long time, perhaps years, perhaps a lifetime. The modern world has trained us to dread the very silence in which the seventh sense becomes audible. It has filled every gap with stimulation, every pause with input, every emptiness with the cheap satisfactions that prevent the deeper hunger from speaking. And so we wonder why our lives feel directionless, why our purposes feel borrowed, why our successes, when they come, feel hollow. The faculty that was meant to guide us has been silenced, not by any malice, but by our own consent. But I want to say to you, as I would say to a younger man sitting across from me in this study, that the silence is still available. The faculty has not gone anywhere. It waits, as it has always waited, on the other side of the work of choosing one purpose and serving it, the work of clearing the inner channels, the work of sitting in stillness long enough for the deeper voice to be heard. I cannot do this work for you. No teacher can. But I can tell you, with the conviction of a lifetime spent watching it operate in the lives of the greatest men of our age, that it is real, and that its rewards are beyond anything the surface world can offer. The men I studied did not become great because they were born great. They became great because they made themselves into instruments through which something greater than themselves could speak. And the instrument, once made, is the most valuable possession a man can carry through his years on this earth. Wealth can be lost, reputation can be tarnished, health declines, but the seventh sense, once awakened and faithfully served, deepens with every passing year. It is the one possession that grows richer as the body grows older, that becomes more luminous as the outer life simplifies, that will accompany you, I have come to suspect, even past the boundary that ends all other things. So I leave you with the question that has accompanied me through every year of my long study, and that I have never been able to answer for anyone but myself. What would your life become if you began today to live as though there were a wiser intelligence within you, waiting to guide you, asking only that you hold your purpose steadily enough and listen quietly enough for it to be heard? What would change in the way you spent your hours? In the way you treated the small impressions that passed through your mind? In the way you held your defeats and your victories alike? The faculty is there. The threshold is there. The question that remains is whether you will spend the rest of your days at the door or whether at last you will walk through.